Rain has a strange way of making people remember things they spent years trying to forget. Maybe that's why Sidwell Carter sat frozen inside his truck for nearly 6 minutes after the funeral ended, staring through a windshield covered in slow-moving rain, while mourners quietly drove away from the cemetery one by one. The world outside looked ordinary enough. Wet pavement, gray skies, a few black umbrellas disappearing into the distance. But inside that truck, something had already started unraveling. Because less than 10 minutes after burying his father, Sidwell received a voicemail from a number he didn't recognize. At first, he almost ignored it. He assumed it was another relative calling to check on him, or somebody from the church asking about flowers and condolences. But then he pressed play, and the second he heard the voice, his entire body stiffened. 22 years disappeared instantly. You still think what happened to us was normal, don't you? It was Emily, his older sister. The same sister who vanished from his life without warning more than 2 decades earlier and never came back. The same sister his father used to call unstable, dramatic, ungrateful. Sidwell hadn't heard her voice since he was 26 years old. Yet somehow, she sounded exactly the same. Calm, tired, and absolutely certain about something he spent most of his life refusing to question. For several seconds after the message ended, Sidwell just sat there breathing heavily while old memories pushed themselves into his mind, whether he wanted them there or not. The hallway light outside his childhood bedroom flickering late at night. The sound of boots moving slowly across hardwood floors. A leather belt hanging beside a closet door, like part of the furniture nobody was supposed to mention. His mother locking herself inside the bathroom after arguments that always ended with silence instead of apologies. Family dinners where nobody spoke unless spoken to. Smiling home videos recorded during birthdays and Christmas mornings where everyone looked happy enough to fool strangers watching from the outside. Sidwell spent years defending those memories because that's what survival looked like inside the Carter house. You defended the family. You defended your father. You convinced yourself strictness meant love because the alternative was admitting something terrifying. Maybe your childhood wasn't normal at all. Maybe the things you called discipline were actually fear wearing a familiar face. The voicemail continued replaying inside his head while rain hit the roof of the truck harder. Then another memory surfaced. Sidwell at 10 years old sitting at the dinner table, trying not to cry after dropping a glass accidentally, while his father stared at him without blinking. Emily reaching beneath the table quietly grabbing his shaking hand before their father could notice. Back then, Sidwell interpreted moments like that as ordinary family tension. Lots of fathers yelled. Lots of households had rules. That's what people said all throughout the Midwest during the 1980s and 90s. Men worked hard. Men came home exhausted. Children respected authority. Nobody talked openly about emotional trauma because most people barely understood the phrase. But memory becomes dangerous when somebody finally forces you to look at it honestly. Suddenly the details start changing shape. The silence around the Carter dinner table no longer felt peaceful inside Sidwell's mind. It felt controlled. The way his mother avoided eye contact no longer looked like exhaustion. It looked like fear. Even the home videos began feeling disturbing the more he thought about them, because every smile now seemed rehearsed for the camera. Then Sidwell remembered the final thing Emily screamed at him the night she disappeared from their lives. He had spent years trying not to think about it, because remembering meant reopening questions he never wanted answered. But grief has a way of weakening the walls people build around painful truths. He remembered standing halfway down the staircase listening to his parents fighting downstairs while thunder shook the windows outside. He remembered hearing glass break, his mother crying, his father shouting so loudly the entire house felt smaller somehow. Then Emily storming toward the front door carrying a backpack while tears ran down her face. Before leaving, she turned towards Sidwell standing frozen on the staircase and shouted something he dismissed for years afterward as anger. One day you're going to realize none of this was normal. Then she disappeared into the storm. By morning, his father told everyone Emily had run away because she was rebellious and emotionally unstable. Sidwell believed him. In fact, he defended that version of the story for most of his adult life because believing anything else meant admitting his sister might have been telling the truth all along. The most disturbing part about stories like this is how ordinary they often appear from the outside. The Carter family attended church every Sunday. Sidwell's father coached Little League baseball during summer. Neighbors described him as disciplined, patriotic, hardworking. Nobody outside the house would have guessed children were measuring their footsteps at night, trying not to make enough noise to attract attention. Nobody saw Emily hiding bruises beneath oversized sweatshirts during high school. Nobody noticed how quickly Sidwell apologized whenever adults sounded frustrated around him. Trauma rarely announces itself loudly in families built around silence. Sometimes it hides inside routines so familiar people stop recognizing them as harmful entirely. And that was exactly what Emily's voicemail threatened to destroy. Not just Sidwell's memories, but his entire understanding of himself. Because if his father wasn't simply strict, then what did that make the childhood Sidwell spent decades defending? What did it mean about the man he eventually became? And perhaps most frightening of all, what parts of his father had he unknowingly carried into his own home without realizing it? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story of Sidwell Carter is not simply about one family hiding painful secrets behind closed suburban doors. It is about what happens when fear becomes so normal during childhood that people stop identifying it as fear entirely. It is about how trauma can pass quietly from one generation into the next while everyone involved continues calling it love, discipline, loyalty, or tradition. And by the end of this story, one question becomes impossible to escape. How much damage can a person carry before they stop recognizing pain as abuse? That question followed Sidwell Carter long before he ever understood why hearing Emily's voice again terrified him so deeply. Because somewhere beneath all the memories he defended for decades, part of him already knew the answer. For most of his adult life, Sidwell Carter believed he understood exactly who his father was. To the outside world, Robert Carter represented a certain kind of old American masculinity many people from his generation recognized immediately. Tough, disciplined, emotionally distant. The type of father who believed children earned respect through obedience instead of affection. Sidwell defended that parenting style constantly because it shaped the man he eventually became. At 48 years old, he owned a successful contracting business outside Indianapolis, coached his son's baseball team during weekends, paid his bills on time, and rarely spoke about emotions unless absolutely necessary. Friends described him as dependable and hardworking. His wife Lauren often joked that Sidwell approached life like a military schedule because every hour of his day felt planned years in advance. Deep down, Sidwell took pride in resembling his father more than he realized. He considered it proof that the Carter family survived hardship correctly. That belief remained stable for decades because people rarely question the foundations of their identity unless something forces them to. And for Sidwell Carter, that something arrived in the form of a voicemail from a sister who vanished 22 years earlier, carrying secrets he never wanted uncovered. Emily Carter had become almost mythical inside the family by the time Sidwell reached middle age. Robert spent years describing her as unstable, dramatic, emotionally difficult, and eventually dangerous. According to his father, Emily abandoned the family because she resented discipline and responsibility. Sidwell accepted that explanation because it was easier than confronting memories that made him uncomfortable. Over time, Emily became the subject nobody discussed openly anymore. Photographs disappeared from shelves. Her name stopped appearing during holidays. Even their mother eventually learned to change the subject whenever old stories drifted too close to painful territory. But now, after decades of silence, Emily suddenly reappeared only hours after Robert Carter's funeral with a single sentence powerful enough to destabilize Sidwell's entire understanding of childhood. "You still think what happened to us was normal, don't you?" That question frightened Sidwell, because part of him already sensed she might be right. Not fully, not consciously, but somewhere beneath years of excuses and rationalizations, old memories had started pressing against the walls he built around them long ago. As the days passed after the funeral, Sidwell became increasingly unsettled by how intensely he reacted whenever childhood entered conversation. Lauren noticed it first during dinner one evening when their teenage daughter casually asked what her grandfather was like when Sidwell was young. The room changed instantly. Sidwell's shoulders tightened. His jaw locked. He answered too quickly, describing Robert as strict but fair before abruptly changing the subject. Later that night, Lauren asked why discussing his father always made him seem nervous. Sidwell dismissed the question immediately, but her observation lingered because he realized she was right. Fear appeared in him before memory even fully surfaced. Certain sounds still triggered reactions he never questioned before. Heavy footsteps in hallways, raised voices downstairs, sudden silence after arguments. Sidwell spent years believing those responses were simply personality traits shaped by growing up in a disciplined household. But after hearing Emily's voicemail, he started wondering whether his body remembered truths his mind spent decades trying to avoid. The internet became an unexpected source of discomfort during those weeks because Sidwell kept stumbling across discussions that mirrored pieces of his own childhood too closely for coincidence. Late at night, after Lauren and the children fell asleep, he found himself reading forums about generational trauma, abusive parenting, and emotional conditioning inside seemingly ordinary families. Survivors described childhood homes where fear disguised itself as respect and silence became the safest form of survival. One woman wrote about apologizing constantly as an adult because she spent childhood trying not to provoke her father's temper. Sidwell stopped reading immediately after that sentence because it felt disturbingly familiar. Another post described children learning to recognize moods from the sound of footsteps approaching down hallways. Again, the recognition hit too hard. The more Sidwell searched, the more uncomfortable similarities emerged between strangers' stories and memories he always defended as normal family life. Yet every time those realizations grew too strong, he instinctively pushed back against them. Robert Carter provided for his family. He worked hard. He never abandoned them. Millions of American fathers behaved exactly like him during that era. That was the argument Sidwell repeated internally whenever doubt became overwhelming. But doubt kept returning anyway, especially after he started watching old family recordings stored inside dusty boxes from his parents' attic. At first, the videos appeared harmless enough. Christmas mornings, backyard cookouts, birthday parties, children laughing while Robert stood nearby grilling burgers or adjusting the camera. Yet the longer Sidwell watched, the stranger the footage began feeling. Emily smiled constantly in those videos, but the smiles rarely reached her eyes. Their mother spoke softly around Robert, as though measuring every sentence carefully before saying it aloud. Young Sidwell himself appeared unusually tense for a child, always glancing toward his father before reacting emotionally to anything. The details were subtle enough that most people might never notice them. But once Sidwell started looking through the recordings honestly, the discomfort became impossible to ignore. During one birthday video, a plate accidentally slipped from Emily's hands and shattered across the kitchen floor. Every person in the room froze instantly before Robert even spoke. The silence that followed lasted only seconds on tape, but Sidwell remembered that silence lasting much longer in real life. He remembered fear arriving first before words ever did. One night, unable to sleep, Sidwell sat alone in his garage, watching another VHS tape transferred onto his laptop while rain tapped softly against the roof above him. Halfway through the recording, he suddenly paused the video after noticing something deeply unsettling. Emily looked directly toward the camera during Thanksgiving dinner while Robert spoke aggressively off-screen about discipline and respect. For less than a second, her expression changed completely. Exhaustion, fear, anger. Then the smile returned the moment Robert stepped back into frame. Sidwell stared at the frozen image for nearly 10 minutes before shutting the laptop abruptly. Without fully understanding why, he gathered several old tapes and carried them toward the trash bin outside. Part of him wanted the evidence gone before it forced him to think too deeply about what he was seeing. That instinct terrified him afterward because destroying memories felt dangerously close to protecting lies. Then Emily sent another voicemail. This time her voice sounded calmer, almost sympathetic. "You were too young to understand what he was doing to us," she said quietly. "That's why I don't blame you for defending him." Sidwell deleted the message immediately after hearing it. His hands actually trembled while pressing the screen. For several minutes, he stood motionless in the kitchen staring at nothing while old memories pressed harder against his thoughts than ever before. He told himself Emily was manipulating him emotionally because she hated their father. He told himself grief was making him overthink ordinary childhood experiences. Yet 30 minutes later, after pacing through the dark house, unable to calm his mind, Sidwell quietly reopened his deleted messages folder and restored the voicemail from trash. That decision mattered more than he realized at the time because it marked the first moment in 22 years that Sidwell Carter stopped running completely from the possibility that Emily had been telling the truth all along. To understand why Sidwell Carter spent most of his life defending his father, you first have to understand the version of himself he worked so hard to become. By 48, Sidwell looked exactly like the kind of American man many people instinctively trust. He woke before sunrise every morning, drank coffee in silence while reviewing construction schedules for the day, and rarely missed a deadline at work. Employees respected him because he never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. Even after long shifts managing job sites across Indianapolis, Sidwell still came home in time to help his son with baseball practice or sit through his daughter's school presentations without complaining once. He loved his family deeply, even if he struggled expressing it emotionally. Lauren often described him as a man who showed affection through responsibility rather than words. If something broke, Sidwell fixed it. If somebody needed help moving furniture or repairing storm damage, he arrived before being asked twice. Friends used the same descriptions for him repeatedly over the years. Dependable, strong, old school. Nobody would have looked at Sidwell Carter and immediately imagined a man carrying unresolved fear from childhood because he spent decades mastering the appearance of stability. That image mattered to Sidwell more than anyone realized because he built his entire identity around proving his upbringing created a successful man instead of a damaged one. In his mind, Robert Carter's harsh parenting explained why he worked harder than most people around him. Discipline created structure. Structure created success. That belief followed Sidwell into adulthood so deeply he repeated it almost automatically whenever conversations about parenting became emotional. He often told younger fathers that modern families had become too soft and emotionally fragile. "Kids need rules," he would say during backyard cookouts while neighbors nodded in agreement. "My father was tough on us too, and we turned out fine." Every time Sidwell said those words, he genuinely believed them. That is what made Emily's sudden return so destabilizing. She was not just challenging memories. She was threatening the entire foundation beneath the person Sidwell believed himself to be. Because if Robert Carter was abusive instead of simply strict, then Sidwell's understanding of love, discipline, masculinity, and even fatherhood might have been shaped by fear all along. The Carter family looked almost perfect from the outside during the early 1990s. They lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Dayton. Ohio, where nearly every lawn stayed trimmed and every family attended the same church on Sundays. Robert Carter fit naturally into that environment because communities like that often admired men who projected authority and discipline confidently. He was a decorated military veteran who worked long hours, spoke little, and expected order inside his household at all times. Neighbors respected him. Teachers praised how polite Sidwell and Emily behaved publicly. At church gatherings, Robert shook hands firmly and volunteered for community projects while their mother Diane smiled quietly beside him. Family photographs from that era showed clean clothes, birthday cakes, camping trips, and Christmas mornings around perfectly decorated trees. Looking back years later, Sidwell realized those images worked almost like evidence in his mind. Proof that nothing truly terrible could have happened inside a family that looked so normal from the outside. But photographs only capture appearances. They do not record tension sitting silently beneath dinner tables or the fear children learn to hide before cameras start rolling. Robert Carter controlled the emotional atmosphere of the house completely. When he entered a room, conversations shifted instantly. Television volumes lowered. Movements became quieter. Diane Carter developed the habit of watching Robert's face carefully before responding to almost anything, because predicting his moods helped avoid conflict later. As children, Sidwell and Emily learned the same behavior without realizing it consciously. They memorized the sound of their father's footsteps after work and understood exactly what kind of evening awaited them, depending on how hard those footsteps struck the hallway floor. Robert rarely needed to scream constantly because anticipation itself became powerful enough. Sometimes silence felt worse than yelling. If dishes were left unwashed or chores unfinished, Robert would simply stare at the problem long enough for panic to spread naturally through the house before saying a single word. Sidwell interpreted that fear as respect because that was how the adults around him described it. Strong fathers commanded authority. Strong households followed rules. That was just how families worked back then, or at least that's what he kept telling himself. Emily experienced Robert differently as she grew older. While Sidwell spent childhood trying desperately to earn approval through obedience, Emily increasingly questioned the atmosphere surrounding them. She argued more during her teenage years. She challenged rules openly. She defended Sidwell whenever Robert's discipline crossed lines neither child fully understood yet. That protectiveness became especially noticeable during family dinners, which often unfolded beneath long stretches of uncomfortable silence broken only by silverware scraping plates softly. Robert controlled conversations the same way he controlled everything else inside the house. Diane rarely contradicted him publicly. Sidwell usually kept his head lowered while eating. Emily alone occasionally pushed back, and every time she did, tension filled the room immediately. Sidwell remembered one night when Emily laughed too loudly at something on television and Robert slammed his hand against the table hard enough to make everyone jump. The entire room froze afterward. Nobody spoke for almost 2 minutes. Looking back as an adult, Sidwell realized moments like that were not ordinary family discipline. They were fear conditioning itself. There were smaller warning signs too, details Sidwell ignored for years because acknowledging them felt impossible. Emily started wearing oversized sweatshirts constantly during high school regardless of weather. Diane flinched visibly whenever objects shattered unexpectedly in the kitchen. Sidwell himself developed the habit of apologizing repeatedly, even when minor inconveniences were not his fault. Loud sounds affected everyone strangely inside the Carter home. A slammed cabinet door or raised voice from another room could silence conversations instantly. But when those reactions become normal during childhood, children stop questioning them eventually. They adapt because adaptation feels safer than resistance. Sidwell genuinely believed most fathers behaved like Robert. The 1990s Midwest culture surrounding him reinforced that belief constantly. Men were expected to be emotionally tough. Children were expected to obey. Families protected their private problems behind closed doors. Therapy was considered weakness in many communities back then. Fear was rarely discussed openly because generations before them survived by pretending emotional pain simply built character. One memory returned to Sidwell repeatedly after Emily's voicemail reopened the past. He was around 11 years old, sitting on the back porch steps late one evening, while Emily smoked secretly beside him after another argument with Robert inside the house. She looked exhausted in a way children should never look. At one point, she turned towards Sidwell very seriously and asked whether he honestly believed other families lived like theirs. Sidwell shrugged awkwardly because he had never known anything different. Then Emily said something he laughed off nervously at the time, without realizing how deeply the sentence would haunt him decades later. "One day you're going to realize this isn't normal." Sidwell remembered rolling his eyes afterward because admitting she might be right felt too frightening even then. It was easier believing Emily was dramatic than considering the possibility that the person raising them had taught fear so effectively his own children mistook it for love. By the time Emily Carter turned 17, the atmosphere inside the Carter house had changed in ways even young Sidwell could no longer completely ignore. What once felt like strict discipline now carried an edge that made the entire family tense before Robert Carter even entered a room. Emily stopped pretending obedience would protect anyone anymore. She challenged rules openly, questioned Robert during arguments, and refused to lower her eyes the way Diane and Sidwell instinctively did whenever tension rose. At first, Robert responded with cold silence, the kind that forced everyone else in the house to walk carefully for hours afterward. But eventually silence turned into shouting matches that shook walls late into the night. Sidwell would lie awake listening to muffled arguments travel through the vents while convincing himself every family probably fought this way sometimes. That is what children often do when chaos becomes familiar enough. They normalize it because accepting reality feels far more frightening than denying it. Yet even Sidwell started noticing things that became harder to explain away. A new hole appeared in the hallway wall near the kitchen after one argument nobody discussed afterward. Emily started hiding her arms beneath oversized sweaters constantly, even during warm weather. Diane cried quietly in the laundry room some nights after Robert fell asleep, though she always insisted allergies caused her red eyes whenever Sidwell asked questions. Still, Sidwell defended his father internally because doing anything else felt impossible. Robert worked long hours. Robert paid the bills. Robert kept food on the table. That was the narrative repeating constantly inside Sidwell's mind whenever doubt surfaced. Sometimes Emily tried forcing him to question it directly. One evening after Robert screamed at Diane for accidentally burning dinner, Emily stormed into Sidwell's room furious that he stayed silent during the argument. "You really think this is normal?" she demanded while pacing beside his bed. Sidwell immediately defended their father the way he always did. "Dad just has a temper," he said quietly. "He doesn't mean half the things he says." Emily stared at him with an expression that looked almost heartbreaking. "That's the problem," she whispered. "You keep finding ways to excuse him." At the time, Sidwell thought Emily was becoming dramatic and rebellious because of typical teenage anger. Looking back years later, he realized she was trying desperately to make him see what fear had already trained him to ignore. The breaking point arrived during the summer of 1998 beneath one of the worst thunderstorms Dayton had seen that year. Sidwell remembered the weather vividly because lightning kept illuminating his bedroom walls every few seconds, while thunder rattled windows hard enough to shake picture frames loose. Around midnight, he woke suddenly to screaming downstairs. Not ordinary arguing. Real screaming. For several confused seconds, he stayed frozen beneath blankets listening to voices crash through the house beneath the storm outside. Robert shouting uncontrollably. Diane crying. Emily screaming back louder than Sidwell had ever heard before. Then came the sound of breaking glass sharp enough to silence everything briefly afterward. Sidwell stepped carefully into the upstairs hallway trembling before slowly moving toward the staircase. What he saw below became the memory he spent decades trying unsuccessfully to blur inside his mind. A shattered lamp scattered across the living room floor. Diane clutching her face while begging Robert to calm down. Emily backed against the wall terrified but refusing to stop yelling. Robert advancing toward her with the kind of rage Sidwell had never fully seen before, because children are rarely prepared for the moment fear inside a parent stops feeling controlled. Young Sidwell stood frozen halfway down the staircase, unable to move, while the scene unfolded beneath him. Emily noticed him first. Their eyes locked for a split second, filled with panic and helplessness. Then Robert grabbed Emily violently by the arm hard enough that she cried out in pain, while Diane rushed forward, trying desperately to pull him back. "Stop it!" Diane screamed repeatedly while thunder shook the house outside. Sidwell remembered wanting to move, wanting to say something, but fear rooted him to the staircase completely. Children raised inside volatile homes often learn the safest survival strategy is stillness. The less attention you attract, the safer you remain. That instinct controlled Sidwell so deeply, by then he could barely breathe properly while watching his family collapse below him. Then suddenly everything stopped. Robert released Emily. Silence flooded the room except for rain hammering the windows. Nobody noticed Sidwell standing there anymore. Robert simply stared toward Emily, breathing heavily before turning away without another word. Emily grabbed a backpack from beside the couch and walked toward the front door, crying openly. Before leaving, she looked back toward the staircase one final time. Years later, Sidwell would still remember that expression with painful clarity because it did not look angry anymore. It looked hopeless. The next morning, Emily Carter was gone. Her bedroom sat half empty with dresser drawers pulled open and several belongings missing. Robert announced calmly during breakfast that Emily ran away because she was selfish and ungrateful after everything the family sacrificed for her. Diane barely touched her food while staring silently at the table. Sidwell asked whether they should call police, but Robert dismissed the idea immediately. "She wants attention," he said coldly. "She'll come crawling back once she realizes how hard the real world is." Sidwell believed him because children trust the explanations adults provide, especially when fear already shapes how they interpret reality. Weeks passed without hearing from Emily, then months. Eventually, her absence transformed into another subject nobody discussed openly inside the Carter house. Robert removed photographs. Diane stopped mentioning her name entirely. Sidwell convinced himself Emily chose to leave voluntarily because accepting anything darker meant confronting terrifying questions about what actually happened that stormy night. Over time, even his memories became softer around the edges. Trauma often works that way. The mind reshapes unbearable moments into versions easier to survive emotionally. But years later, after Robert Carter's funeral reopened the past, Sidwell discovered something that shattered the story he defended for more than 2 decades. Hidden inside old county records stored online was a police report dated the exact night Emily disappeared. At 11:47 p.m., emergency services received a domestic disturbance call from the Carter residence. The caller disconnected before giving details, but officers were dispatched anyway because screaming could reportedly be heard briefly in the background. According to the report, police arrived 22 minutes later after the storm delayed response times. Robert answered the door alone, insisting everything was under control and describing the argument as a minor family disagreement involving an emotionally unstable teenage daughter. Officers left shortly afterward without entering the house fully because no formal complaint remained active. Emily disappeared less than an hour later. Sitting alone in his office reading the report decades afterward, Sidwell felt something inside him shift permanently. Emily had not simply run away after another family argument. She tried calling for help first, and nobody came in time. After discovering the police report connected to the night Emily disappeared, Sidwell Carter found himself unable to return to normal life, no matter how desperately he tried. The version of childhood he defended for decades had started cracking open, and once those cracks appeared, old memories began slipping through constantly. He stopped focusing at work. Conversations with Lauren felt distant. Even ordinary sounds inside the house triggered strange reactions he no longer understood. One evening, while cleaning out the remaining boxes from Robert Carter's garage after the funeral, Sidwell uncovered an old locked metal container shoved behind shelves covered in dust. Inside were things his father clearly never intended anyone else to find. Cassette tapes labeled only with dates. Medical paperwork folded carefully inside envelopes. Old notebooks belonging to Diane Carter. And several police documents involving domestic disturbance complaints Sidwell never knew existed. The moment he realized his father kept those records hidden intentionally, a cold feeling settled inside his chest because it meant Robert remembered those incidents differently than he claimed publicly. People do not bury evidence of harmless family arguments inside locked containers. They bury things they fear becoming visible. At first, Sidwell approached the discoveries cautiously because part of him still wanted to believe Emily exaggerated the past emotionally after years away from the family. That possibility felt safer than accepting the alternative. But each new document pushed him further from the explanations he relied on his entire adult life. One medical record showed Diane visited an emergency clinic in 1996 for cracked ribs supposedly caused by falling down basement stairs. Another report described bruising along her shoulder and wrist consistent with repeated blunt impact. Sidwell remembered that week vividly because his mother spent days moving slowly around the house, while Robert insisted she injured herself carrying laundry. Back then, Sidwell accepted the explanation immediately because questioning it never even crossed his mind. Now, reading the doctor's notes decades later, the memory transformed into something unrecognizable. Then he found Diane's journals. Most entries focused on ordinary family routines, grocery lists, church events, and parenting frustrations. But scattered between those pages were sentences revealing fear she never voiced aloud publicly. One entry stopped Sidwell cold completely. The children have started apologizing before they've even done anything wrong. He reread that line at least 10 times because it described something he still did as an adult without ever questioning why. The cassette tapes disturbed him even more. Late one night after Lauren and the children fell asleep, Sidwell sat alone in his garage listening through headphones while rain tapped softly against the roof overhead. Some recordings captured ordinary family conversations accidentally taped over old music cassettes, but others sounded intentional. Arguments, long silences, Diane crying quietly in another room, Robert lecturing Emily about obedience for nearly 20 uninterrupted minutes, while Emily barely spoke at all. The most unsettling part was hearing his own childhood voice in the background, sounding constantly nervous and eager to avoid conflict. At one point during a recording, young Sidwell apologized repeatedly because he spilled milk during dinner. Robert responded with terrifying calmness instead of yelling. "Look how tense you are all the time," he said coldly. "That's because weak people expect punishment." Listening decades later, Sidwell realized his father did not just control behavior through anger. He conditioned fear itself into the structure of daily life so deeply that everyone inside the house adapted around it automatically. As these discoveries piled up, Sidwell became obsessed with searching online for explanations he never imagined applying to his own life before. Every night, he disappeared deeper into forums discussing childhood trauma, emotional abuse, PTSD, and generational conditioning. Survivors described growing up in homes where love depended entirely on avoiding mistakes. Adults explained how they still flinched when hearing footsteps approach unexpectedly or struggled expressing emotions without fear of conflict. Sidwell recognized himself in almost every story he read. One man described becoming emotionally distant with his children because vulnerability felt dangerous after growing up around explosive anger. Another explained how abuse survivors often defend harmful parents fiercely because admitting the truth threatens their entire sense of identity. That sentence haunted Sidwell especially because it explained exactly why he spent decades protecting Robert Carter's reputation even after Emily disappeared. The more he researched, the more terrifying the pattern became. His childhood reactions were not isolated personality traits. They were textbook survival behaviors shared by thousands of people raised inside emotionally volatile homes. But uncertainty still poisoned everything because every answer created new questions. Sidwell began wondering whether Emily's memories could have become distorted after years away from the family. Trauma changes perception sometimes. What if she genuinely believed Robert was more dangerous than he really was? Then another part of Sidwell questioned Diane's role entirely. Why did she stay? Why protect Robert publicly for so many years if things were truly as bad as Emily claimed? Some nights, Sidwell convinced himself Robert's military history explained everything instead. Robert served during violent overseas conflicts before returning home emotionally hardened and unstable in ways nobody around him understood properly during the 1980s. Maybe untreated trauma transformed him gradually into someone neither Diane nor the children knew how to handle safely. Then there were the neighbors. Surely somebody outside the Carter house noticed something eventually. Arguments loud enough to shake walls. Police arriving after midnight. Emily disappearing suddenly at 17. Yet nobody intervened meaningfully. The uncertainty surrounding every possibility became emotionally exhausting because Sidwell no longer trusted his own memories enough to separate truth from conditioning. Lauren noticed the deterioration long before Sidwell admitted it himself. He stopped sleeping properly almost overnight. Some mornings, she found him sitting silently in the kitchen before sunrise, staring at old family photographs with dark circles beneath his eyes. Small frustrations began triggering anger disproportionate to the situation. One evening, his son accidentally spilled orange juice across the dinner table, and Sidwell snapped loudly enough that both children froze instantly. The silence afterward hit him like physical pain because their expressions looked disturbingly familiar. Fear. Immediate fear. The same fear he remembered feeling around Robert throughout childhood. Lauren calmly told the children to finish dinner upstairs before turning towards Sidwell with visible concern. "You scared them," she whispered softly. Sidwell immediately apologized, but the damage lingered because for the first time in his life, he recognized his father's voice emerging through his own behavior. Not identical actions, not violence, but the atmosphere, the tension, the instinct to control emotional environments through fear instead of understanding. That realization destroyed him more than anything else he uncovered inside the old boxes. For weeks afterward, Sidwell watched himself constantly around his family, searching for traces of Robert Carter, hiding inside habits he once considered normal parenting. He noticed how quickly his daughter apologized during conversations, even when unnecessary. He realized Lauren avoided contradicting him during tense moments to keep peace inside the house. He recognized how his children carefully monitored his moods before asking difficult questions. None of those behaviors looked dramatic enough individually to qualify as abuse in his mind. But together, they formed a pattern terrifyingly similar to the emotional atmosphere he grew up inside. One night, Sidwell stood outside his son's bedroom after accidentally raising his voice earlier during homework frustration. Through the partially open door, he overheard his son telling his sister quietly, "Dad's in one of his moods again." The sentence shattered something inside him because he remembered saying nearly identical words about Robert Carter decades earlier. And suddenly the most frightening possibility of all became impossible to ignore. What if trauma survives not because people intentionally repeat cruelty, but because they mistake inherited fear for ordinary family life? The first time Sidwell Carter saw Emily again after 22 years, he almost didn't recognize her. They agreed to meet at a small diner outside Cincinnati, halfway between their two cities, because Emily refused to return anywhere near Dayton. Sidwell arrived nearly 40 minutes early and spent most of that time staring nervously through the restaurant window, wondering whether he should leave before she arrived. Part of him still feared hearing things he could never emotionally recover from once spoken aloud. But when Emily finally walked through the front door, the strangest feeling hit him immediately. She looked older, obviously, more tired. Life had carved exhaustion into her face in ways photographs never fully capture. Yet beneath all of it, Sidwell still saw the same older sister who used to squeeze his hand beneath dinner tables whenever Robert Carter's moods darkened unexpectedly. Emily sat across from him quietly for several moments before either spoke. Then she asked the question Sidwell had secretly feared since the funeral. "Do you finally believe me?" He wanted to answer immediately, but the truth felt too complicated for simple words anymore. Because by then, Sidwell no longer doubted something terrible happened inside the Carter house. What terrified him was realizing how much of it he spent his life defending. Emily did not begin with dramatic accusations or emotional outbursts the way Sidwell expected. In fact, her calmness unsettled him more than anger would have. She explained things carefully, almost clinically, as though she spent years forcing herself to organize painful memories into something survivable. Yes, Robert Carter physically abused the family for years. He hit walls, grabbed arms hard enough to leave bruises, threw objects during arguments, sometimes worse. But according to Emily, the physical violence was not even the most damaging part of growing up inside that house. The real damage came from conditioning. Robert trained the entire family to interpret fear as normal love and control as protection. "That's why you defended him for so long," Emily told Sidwell quietly while stirring untouched coffee between her hands. "He taught us obedience was respect. He taught Mom silence was loyalty. He taught you pain meant discipline, and discipline meant love." Sidwell felt nauseous listening because every sentence explained behaviors he carried unconsciously into adulthood without ever questioning where they came from. Robert Carter never needed to beat his family constantly because he shaped the emotional rules governing the house itself. Everyone adapted around his anger until fear stopped feeling unusual entirely. Then Emily placed several VHS tapes onto the diner table between them. Sidwell recognized the faded labels instantly from childhood birthdays and holidays. "I kept copies before I left," she explained softly. Later that evening, they sat together inside Emily's apartment, watching the recordings one by one for the first time as adults no longer protected by denial. At first, the tapes looked harmless enough, exactly like the old family videos Sidwell remembered from childhood. Christmas mornings, camping trips, backyard cookouts, Robert grilling hamburgers while Diane smiled beside him, young Sidwell laughing while opening birthday presents. But Emily paused the footage, constantly forcing Sidwell to notice details he spent years overlooking automatically. During one recording, Robert entered the living room unexpectedly, and every conversation stopped immediately, even though nobody consciously seemed aware of it happening. In another video, Diane smiled for the camera while tears remained visible along the corners of her eyes after an argument moments earlier. Sidwell watched Emily subtly position herself between Robert and his younger self repeatedly throughout nearly every tape, without realizing she had done it at the time. Once pointed out, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Emily was not rebellious simply because she hated authority. She spent years trying to absorb Robert's anger before it reached Sidwell directly. The deeper they moved through the footage, the harder it became for Sidwell to keep defending the version of childhood he spent decades preserving emotionally. There was one tape in particular that shattered him completely. Thanksgiving 1997. The family sat around the dining table while Robert lectured everyone about respect and gratitude. Young Sidwell barely touched his food because he accidentally spilled water earlier in the evening. Every time Robert raised his voice slightly, Sidwell visibly flinched on camera before forcing nervous smiles afterward. Emily paused the tape, repeatedly asking one devastating question over and over again. "Do you see yourself?" At first, Sidwell resisted because admitting what the footage showed felt unbearable. But eventually he could not avoid it anymore. The fear visible on his childhood face looked nothing like ordinary discipline. It looked like survival. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization of all was understanding he never recognized it earlier, because terror had been normalized before he became old enough to question it properly. Sidwell finally broke down halfway through the tapes. Not quietly either. Years of denial collapsed all at once beneath the weight of evidence he could no longer rationalize away. He cried harder than he had during Robert Carter's funeral because grief feels different once truth enters it. "Why didn't I see it?" he kept repeating while sitting hunched forward with his hands covering his face. Emily answered him with painful honesty. "Because children aren't supposed to realize they're being abused while it's happening," she said softly. "Especially when the people hurting them are also the people feeding them, raising them, and telling them they love them." That sentence explains something Sidwell struggled understanding his entire adult life. Abuse rarely looks monstrous every moment of every day inside families like theirs. Sometimes it hides inside ordinary routines, mixed together with affection, financial support, family vacations, and occasional moments of genuine care. That confusion traps children emotionally because they learn to associate fear and love together until separating them later becomes incredibly difficult. Then Emily revealed the final truth that changed everything Sidwell thought he knew about their mother too. Diane Carter had tried leaving Robert several times during their childhood. The first attempt happened when Sidwell was only 7 years old. Emily remembered because Diane packed bags secretly while Robert worked late shifts for nearly 2 weeks preparing to take the children to her sister's house in Michigan. But the night before they planned to leave, Robert discovered everything. According to Emily, he locked himself inside the garage holding a handgun while threatening suicide repeatedly if Diane abandoned him. The second attempt happened years later after police responded to another domestic disturbance call. Again, Robert threatened to kill himself while blaming Diane for destroying the family. Emily explained that Diane stayed afterward not because she believed Robert would change, but because she became emotionally trapped inside constant fear and guilt. "Mom thought keeping us together was safer than risking what he might do if we left," Emily whispered. Sitting there listening, Sidwell realized the Carter family had not remained together because love held them in place. They stayed because Robert Carter controlled the emotional gravity of the entire house through fear powerful enough to reshape everyone living inside it. When Sidwell Carter returned home after meeting Emily, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Lauren was helping their daughter finish homework at the kitchen table while their son watched television quietly in the living room. Nothing appeared broken. Nothing looked dangerous. For a few brief seconds, Sidwell almost convinced himself he had overreacted emotionally to everything Emily revealed. But once certain truths become visible, ordinary moments stop feeling ordinary forever. That realization hit him less than 20 minutes later when his son accidentally knocked over a glass while reaching across the dinner table. The sound startled everyone. Instinctively, Sidwell raised his voice sharply before he could stop himself. "Watch what you're doing." The room went silent immediately afterward. His son froze, not because the words themselves were especially cruel, but because of the fear behind his reaction. Sidwell saw it instantly this time. The same fear he remembered carrying through childhood whenever Robert Carter's moods shifted unexpectedly. His son apologized 3 separate times within less than a minute while cleaning the spill with shaking hands. And suddenly Sidwell no longer saw a normal family dinner unfolding in front of him. He saw patterns, learned behaviors, emotional tension spreading quietly through a room before anyone consciously acknowledged it. Over the following days, Sidwell started observing his household with a kind of painful awareness he never possessed before. Once he stopped automatically defending the atmosphere surrounding him, details emerged everywhere. Lauren avoided contradicting him publicly during disagreements, even over small issues, because years together taught her it was easier to maintain peace than risk emotional distance afterward. His daughter apologized constantly for minor mistakes that did not require apologies at all. When Sidwell walked into rooms frustrated after difficult days at work, conversations between the children often stopped briefly before continuing more carefully. None of these moments looked dramatic enough individually to resemble the violent household Emily described from their childhood. That was what frightened Sidwell most. Trauma does not always survive through identical actions repeated exactly across generations. Sometimes it survives through emotional atmospheres inherited so subtly people carrying them never recognize the damage until somebody finally forces them to look honestly. Sidwell spent decades believing he escaped becoming Robert Carter because he never used violence the same way his father did. But now he realized fear can exist inside homes long before physical harm ever appears. One night after everyone else fell asleep, Sidwell sat alone in the dark living room, replaying conversations with Emily repeatedly inside his head while old VHS tapes rested untouched beside him on the coffee table. That was when he finally searched Emily's name online for the first time beyond social media profiles and public records. What he discovered stunned him completely. Emily spent nearly 15 years working with domestic abuse survivors through counseling programs across Ohio and Kentucky. She volunteered at shelters, spoke at trauma recovery conferences, helped women relocate safely after leaving violent households. One article described Emily as someone deeply committed to breaking cycles of generational abuse. Sidwell stared at the screen, unable to process the realization fully, because suddenly Emily's disappearance all those years ago looked entirely different. She had not spent decades running from the Carter family simply out of anger or rebellion. She spent those years trying to understand what happened to them while helping other people survive similar pain. Later, when Sidwell finally asked her directly why she devoted her entire life to that work, Emily answered with heartbreaking simplicity, "I needed somebody to survive this even if it couldn't be me." That sentence stayed with Sidwell for days afterward because it revealed how differently the two of them survived the same childhood. Emily escaped physically and spent years confronting the truth directly, no matter how painful it became. Sidwell survived by normalizing everything instead, by defending Robert, by convincing himself fear and love naturally belong together inside families. Eventually, he asked Emily the question haunting him most. "Why didn't you hate me for defending him all those years?" Emily remained quiet for several seconds before answering softly, "Because that's what abuse does to people." Then she said something that completely destroyed the last pieces of denial still living inside him. The scariest part about abuse is when victims start defending it. Silence followed afterwards so heavily neither of them spoke again for nearly a full minute. Because Sidwell suddenly understood the true damage Robert Carter caused inside that family. It was not only bruises, screaming, or fear during childhood. It was conditioning his own children to protect the very system hurting them. Robert taught loyalty, so effectively his son carried those lessons into adulthood without ever realizing he was preserving trauma itself. A few nights later, Lauren woke up around 2 in the morning and found Sidwell sitting alone in darkness watching old family videos again without sound. She sat beside him quietly for a while before finally asking what he saw in those tapes that frightened him so much. Sidwell struggled answering because the truth felt almost impossible to explain clearly even now. Eventually, he whispered something barely loud enough for her to hear. "I thought surviving it meant it wasn't abuse." Lauren took his hand gently while tears filled his eyes for the first time since they married. The devastating part was not simply realizing Robert Carter hurt the family years earlier. The devastating part was understanding how easily people adapt to pain once it becomes familiar enough. Children raised around fear stop recognizing fear. Homes built around emotional instability start feeling normal because they are all someone has ever known. And once those patterns settle deeply enough into identity, victims often spend years protecting the very behaviors slowly damaging them. That is what makes stories like Sidwell Carter's so unsettling long after they end. Most people imagine abuse as something obvious, loud, violent, easy to identify from the outside. But some of the deepest emotional damage happens quietly inside families that still attend church together, celebrate birthdays together, and smile during holiday photographs. Fear hides inside routines, inside silence, inside children learning to monitor moods before speaking, inside wives trying to keep peace by avoiding disagreement, inside fathers convincing themselves harshness equals strength because that is how they were raised too. And maybe the most disturbing question this story leaves behind is not whether Robert Carter was abusive. By the end, that truth becomes painfully clear. The real question is far more uncomfortable than that. If pain becomes normal early enough, how would anyone recognize they were living inside it? Stories like Sidwell Carter's stay with people because they force us into uncomfortable territory most families spend generations avoiding. It would be easier if trauma always looked obvious. Easier if every abusive household matched the frightening images people expect from television and headlines. But many families survive for years appearing completely normal from the outside, while fear quietly shapes every conversation happening behind closed doors. That is why Sidwell's story unsettles so many people watching it. He was not an evil man. He loved his children. He worked hard. He genuinely believed he turned out fine because surviving pain often convinces people the pain must have been necessary somehow. And maybe that is the most dangerous lie trauma teaches. Not just that suffering is normal, but that repeating parts of it proves strength instead of damage. By the time Sidwell finally understood what Robert Carter truly passed down through the family, he had already spent years carrying pieces of that same emotional atmosphere into his own home without realizing it. The difficult part about stories like this is that there are no simple villains or easy endings. Robert Carter caused enormous harm inside that family, but Robert himself came from a generation where emotional repression, untreated trauma, and fear-based parenting were often mistaken for discipline and masculinity. Diane Carter stayed because terror and guilt trapped her emotionally long before she stopped believing escape was possible. Emily survived by running. Sidwell survived by defending the system completely. Every person inside that house adapted differently to the same pain. And maybe that is why this story creates such divided reactions from people watching. Some viewers will see Sidwell entirely as a victim, a child conditioned so deeply he lost the ability to recognize fear for what it was until adulthood forced him to confront it honestly. Others will argue that understanding trauma does not erase the responsibility of repeating harmful patterns later in life. Both perspectives contain uncomfortable truth. And perhaps the fact that this debate feels complicated at all says something important about how generational trauma actually works. So now the question becomes yours. Do you think Sidwell Carter was only a victim of the environment he grew up inside? Or do you believe he became responsible once he started continuing parts of the cycle with his own children? Can trauma excuse harmful behavior if someone genuinely never learned a healthier version of love growing up? And if you had seen the Carter family during the 1990s, sitting together in church every Sunday, smiling politely beside one another, would you have recognized the warning signs hidden underneath the surface? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments, because conversations like this matter more than most people realize. Sometimes people do not recognize emotional damage until they hear someone else describe experiences almost identical to their own. And if you think this story was disturbing, wait until you hear what was hidden inside the next family. So subscribe and turn on notifications because the next story might change the way you look at ordinary people forever.